Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Dr. Fredrik Lauritzen. Listeners, Fredrik is the Science Director at Anti-Doping Norway, and in our conversation today, I'm looking forward to learning more about Anti-Doping Norway, use of intelligence-based approaches in anti-doping, and also some of Fredrik's recent research investigating the effectiveness of using intelligence in the test planning process. So, Fredrik, we are excited to welcome you to the show. How are you today?
I'm excellent, and thank you so much, Marie, for inviting me to the podcast.
Well, we are excited to learn from you today, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. Can you start maybe by telling us just a little bit more about Anti-Doping Norway and its mission?
Well, according to our current strategic plan, our mission is to strive for clean sport and a doping-free society, and to protect the real winners and promote a healthy training environment, both within and outside organized sports. So it's that simple and that difficult. We are about 30 people at the office in Oslo. And in addition, we have about 60 DCOs and 5-6 educators working part-time scattered across Norway. As most NATOs, our core operation has always been and still is anti-doping within organized sports. But we are also active in other areas, such as in fitness centers. We do some work in correctional facilities, together with municipalities, schools, and health services, and others also. When it comes to funding, the largest part of our funding comes from the Ministry of Culture, but we also have some annual funding from the Directorate of Health, which is specifically targeted at the work we are doing outside organized sports. So that's pretty much who we are and what we do.
Oh, fantastic. And I know this is an exciting year for Anti-Doping Norway. You're celebrating the organization's 20-year anniversary. So, Fredrik, what are some of these major advances or milestones that the organization has achieved over the past 20 years?
Well, it's not easy to sum up 20 years in a couple of bullet points, but and I've been there since 2014. Mm-hmm. But we have some employees actually that have been there since the beginning, including the current CEO, Anders Solheim. And looking back, it's no doubt that the organization has grown in all aspects during those 20 years. I think some milestones worth mentioning is when it comes to testing, first, that we started collecting samples for blood profiles in 2004, 2005. We later took the initiative to establish the Nordic Athlete Passport Management Unit in 2012. We now collaborate with Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland on the Passport Management Unit, which is located here in Oslo. Back in 2007, 2008, we developed a physiologically based risk assessment for test planning, which is still in use together with the WADA standards. And I think also, which we will get back to later in this discussion, that in 2016, we employed a couple of former police officers to systematically collect and process confidential source information and tips related to possible anti-doping rule violations. And this has been a great success and has improved testing effectiveness considerably. There are also some progress being made in education, of course. We launched the first e-learning program for athletes and athletes personnel in 2008. It's called Real Winner in English. The program has been revised and updated several times since 2008, and the latest version was launched last year, about a year ago, and we now have about 25,000 users in 1 year. We are very happy with that. Outside sports, I think for some people working in anti-doping, we are also known for having programs outside organized sports, for example, the fitness center program. And we also get a lot of interest from our international colleagues when we talk about that one. That collaboration was first launched back in 2004 in collaboration with the industry itself. And the fitness centers, they actually pay an annual fee to be part of that program. So this way, the program is self-financed and we don't have to use funding from the ministry to cover the costs related to the fitness center program. And now that program has also evolved and been updated several times. And now about half of all the fitness centers in Norway are part of that Clean Fitness Center program, which has been very important for us when it comes to targeting youth and also recreational exercisers.
Well, Fredrik, it sounds like a remarkable program. And in general, you have a lot of exciting achievements to celebrate there at Anti-Doping Norway. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your position. I mentioned in our introduction that you're the science director there. What are some of your responsibilities in this role?
Well, it's actually quite varied. It's a new position. It was established in 2020. And I think my most important responsibility is to bring forward new information and knowledge that can be used to enhance the quality and the effectiveness of our work. And this is done by trying to encourage students and other researchers to engage in projects that are of relevance to our work, and also by planning and conducting research within Anti-Doping Norway together with a couple of my colleagues here. We have an internal research group which discuss current projects and come up with the new projects. I think that's very useful and something that probably most NATOs should consider. I know several NATOs, they have these groups already. I think also another point worth mentioning is that the science director position at Anti-Doping Norway is not directly affiliated with any of the other main departments. And this means that I'm not involved in testing, education, or medical TU issues on a daily basis. Instead, I have a pretty free role, and I can initiate and conduct research across all the different areas we are working with. I think also this makes it easier for me to have a critical view on what we're doing, like we have done in the paper we'll discuss later in this conversation.
Absolutely. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your background. I know everyone takes a different path going through to find their position in anti-doping. So what is your particular background, Fredrik, and how did you get to this position in Anti-Doping Norway?
Well, I finished my master's in muscle physiology back in 2008 at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, and then went directly on to do a PhD in neuroscience, as I went from muscle to brain at the University of Oslo. I spent a year abroad, Yale University in Connecticut during my PhD. It was very useful. And after I got my PhD in 2012, I worked a couple of years in the university sector before starting in anti-doping in 2014. So it's almost 10 years in anti-doping.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm a fellow neuroscientist myself, so I get excited talking about the brain.
Excellent. Great.
So how does this background help you in your current position?
I think when it comes to the details you work on during your PhD, I don't use those details and that knowledge specifically as much. But I think it's more of the process. You can be creative, solve problems, the ability to learn new things, to communicate science. I think those basic things are important in many, many career paths.
And then in terms of Anti-Doping Norway, what are some of your current scientific priorities or things that you're really focusing on at the moment, Fredrik?
Well, we have a broad perspective on what constitutes anti-doping science. We try to have projects covering many different aspects of anti-doping, such as testing, medicine, education, and prevention. And we have had three main focus areas in the last couple of years, which is doping trends in Norwegian sport and evaluation of our testing and ABP programs. We've also done several projects on the use of pharmaceutical drugs and dietary supplements, both in athletes, but also among recreational exercisers in gyms, for example. And we've done some projects on the effectiveness of our own anti-doping prevention programs in schools and also in correctional facilities.
Oh, very interesting. And you mentioned that this research group is internal to Anti-Doping Norway. How do you choose which projects to pursue? It seems like there are so many interesting directions you could go or unanswered questions in anti-doping.
I think you just have to narrow it down and agree on some directions that you're going to follow. And we have now focused on projects related to the main areas of Anti-Doping Norway, where the most of the resources are going into, which is testing and also education. And all the projects related to drug use and dietary supplements in sport is more based on all the requests we're getting from athletes and athlete support personnel about these topics. The whole medicalization of sport topic is very interesting and relevant at the moment.
Definitely. And to dig a little deeper into the testing and investigation side of things, I know in WADA's International Standard for Testing and Investigation, or ISTI, there are actually mandatory standards for test distribution planning, sample collection procedures, and the use of anti-doping intelligence. So these ISTI standards specifically require that anti-doping organizations develop an annual testing distribution plan, which people may not be aware of in the general public. So for Anti-Doping Norway, Fredrik, what is the process for actually developing this plan to meet the standard?
Well, we collect just below 3,000 samples per year, which is actually a lot when you look at the size of the country, but we have many active athletes. Mm-hmm. And we also test on not only on the elite level, but also on the intermediate and lower level as well. But these tests are distributed by following the principles of physiologically based risk assessment that we developed back in 2008. And also by following, of course, the mandatory steps described in the ISTE and the WADA guidelines. And we use factors such as the physical demands of the sport, the performance-enhancing potential of using prohibited substances, financial factors, history of doping, tips, previous test plans, athletes' career, season calendar, and so on when we plan the test.
Very interesting. And you've mentioned this physiological-based risk assessment. And I think just to maybe help all of our listeners get on the same page to make sure we understand the differences or the nuances in the terminology, how is this physiological-based risk assessment different from traditional risk assessment approaches and different from this intelligence-based testing?
In short, and this is how I and we see it, it's not an official definition, but for us, intelligence-based testing relates to samples collected based on a specific piece of confidential source information, such as a tip or any other intelligence about potential ADRVs or suspicious performances by a specific athlete. So it's very targeted. Whereas a traditional risk assessment approach, you use more general information about the intrinsic properties of the sport, doping history of the sport, performance enhancing potential of using particular substances in that sport, season calendar, and so on, to make decisions on who to test and when to test. I think maybe an optimal approach for the future will be to combine those two, but maybe where the factors related to tips and intelligence are given more weight than many of the other factors. That's at least what we have seen in the studies we have done, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. And then how does this maybe physiological-based risk assessment kind of fit into the picture?
Well, I think it fits well, but what we saw from the study was that in most of the sports where you have a long national history of doping, and where the performance is often measured in kilograms or speed or height and those basic physiological properties, you have very few anti-doping rule violations, in fact. So to use that standard approach for test planning doesn't actually work that well to detect doping, at least not in Norway.
Oh, that's very interesting, Fredrik. Thank you for taking the time to kind of break that down for us. And I understand that you and Geir Holden recently published a study investigating the effectiveness of using intelligence-based doping control planning. And before even being able to tackle the question of effectiveness, you first had to really get a better understanding of doping practices in Norwegian athletes. So what methods did you use to do this?
So we used our annual reports, our own archives, and also data extracted from the WADA ADAMS system. And we systemized it, all the doping control and ADRV statistics, all the way back from 2003, when ADNO was established, and up until 2019, which was the last normal year before the pandemic, so to speak. And in total, we collected 48,000 samples in that period and had 216 ADRVs. So for each year of sample collection, we registered the total sample number, sample per matrix, test type, which means whether it was in competition, out of competition, gender, distribution, athlete level distribution, sport category, and so on. And we did the same thing for all the ADRVs. Year of sanction, ADRV article, the gender of the athlete, age, sport, athlete level, sample type, substance, if analytical, and so on. And then we put all this data together and wanted to see whether we could find some interesting patterns in the test and doping case history of anti-doping Norway.
Absolutely. And I guess maybe even just looking at this initial data set of the doping practices, were you surprised or were your expectations met, I guess, in terms of the number and the distribution of these ADRVs?
Well, it was a bit surprising. Even though you have these numbers on an annual basis in the annual report, you get a different picture when you put everything together, 17 years of testing. So that was a valuable exercise in itself. I think one of the most surprising findings was that there was no real correlation between the number of samples we collected in a year or totally and the number of ADRVs we got, because often you see the notion that the more samples you collect, the more ADRVs you will also get. And that the key to a more effective anti-doping program is to collect more samples. But in our case, that was not the case. We also found that most of the ADRVs were in more complex sports, such as in ball and team sports, which are considered not high risk compared to sports such as in athletics, cycling, cross-country skiing for us. But you had a lot of ADRVs in more complex sports and also at lower level, which are not tested as much. More than 1/3 of the samples we collected in this period was collected among the RTP athletes, elite athletes in sports, where there's a possibility to use doping outside of competition. But they had very, very few ADRVs in this period. But then when we tried to look at the effect of using intelligence in the test planning process, so that this was very important and was associated with an increase in the ADRVs. In fact, 52%, or more than half of all ADRVs in the national testing program in the period 2016 to 2019 had its origin in intelligence, although intelligence-based testing only comprised a fraction of all the tests. So based on these results, it was very clear for us that we must test smarter and not more to improve detection rates.
Absolutely. And can you explain why the period looking at intelligence-based testing was between 2016 and 2019? What changes maybe happened there in 2016 that allowed you to get that information?
Yeah, that's a good question, because intelligence and tips have been part of the test planning and risk assessment for many, many years. But it was first in 2016 that Anti-Doping Norway employed former police officers that started to systematically collect and process this kind of information and could spend more resources on following up on the tips what we got. So that's why we selected the period 2016 to 2019.
Excellent. And what, I guess, are the mechanisms through which these tips and this confidential information is coming in? Are there hotlines? What channels are open for people to report these things?
It can vary. So, of course, there's a whistleblower hotline. We can get tips from on emails and regular phone calls. We get some tips from DCOs out in the field, from other sources. It can also be our own test planners following athletes on social media, for example, seeing suspicious activity, and then planning tests accordingly. It also, of course, can be suspicious ABP profiles that can also lead to anti-doping rule violations. So there's a lot of different sources of this intelligence that can be used to improve target testing.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this strong positive correlation that you saw when looking at the ADRVs and this confidential source information. I think I was surprised to see when I was reading the paper that this was not the case for that traditional risk assessment approach. So how did that factor into your analyses and just how you thought about how you're going to manage the program going forward?
It's a surprising but also interesting finding, because when we discuss anti-doping testing and anti-doping programs, it many times comes down to the numbers. How many samples do you collect? And a good program is most of the time associated with a high number of samples collected. But as we have seen, the number of samples is alone not enough. You have to select the samples where the risk is higher to get the positives. But then you have the whole issue with deterrence, which complicate this test planning, because, of course, if you have a lot of tests, the deterrence effect will probably be stronger. So you cannot only do testing based on tips and intelligence. You have to test broader to get the deterrent effect also.
Absolutely. And I guess, is there any way to capture or see the effects of this deterrent effect of a program? Is there any sort of survey or even qualitative measures that you guys are able to collect?
We didn't examine the deterrent effect of testing in this project, but we found that athletes being subjected to the highest amount of testing, they had very, very few ADRVs, even though they competed at the highest level in traditionally high-risk doping sports, which indicates that testing did have a deterrent effect. I think this makes it complicated to assess the quality of a testing program, because if you get few positive samples, it can, of course, mean that you're not doing a very good job to catch the cheaters. But it can also mean that you have very few athletes that are using prohibited substances, maybe because the tests you are taking are having such a strong deterrent effect. Or maybe your education activities are so effective that athletes refrain from doping. So it's a little bit more complicated than using the ADRV to sample ratio alone as a measure of quality.
Absolutely. I think it is a challenge. You hit the nail on the head there, that having these low ADRV numbers either means you're doing really well with your anti-doping program or you're doing very poorly. And it's really difficult to differentiate what is actually happening out there. And we talked about the results of this study. Was there anything else you wanted to share, or kind of future directions that you're going to take this research?
I think from our side, the findings from the study have already resulted in a revised testing strategy for Anti-Doping Norway. where we have a larger emphasis on target testing and the use of intelligence in the test planning process. Now we have even one more former police officer. So now there are 3 people working on with intelligence in the test planning and helping the test planners to put the tests where they are most likely to find doping. It'll be very exciting to follow that in the next couple of years. And it's, of course, a bit early to conclude on the success of the new strategy, but I think it's already going pretty well. And we have, when we look at 2022, so last year, we have never had as many ADRVs in the history of anti-doping Norway as we had last year.
Oh, wow.
So I think we're going in the right direction.
That is fantastic. And you mentioned specifically how the results of just this one study are already having an impact there at Anti-Doping Norway in terms of how you're planning the testing there. But I guess maybe thinking a little bit more broadly, how does Anti-Doping Norway continue to innovate and incorporate findings from research, whether it's funded by the PCC or other organizations, to continue to advance and improve their anti-doping programs?
So research obviously plays a vital role in strengthening the anti-doping programs. And the field of anti-doping science is very broad, from more analytical to more practical. And we need all those sides going forward. I think it's also important to make sure that the results of these studies are not only something that is being discussed among academics and researchers, but that they are accessible to practitioners that work with anti-doping on a daily basis. The NATO community get access to the results and can use the results to improve their own work. That will be important, I think.
Absolutely. And our listeners may or may not know that there's actually a WADA-accredited Norwegian doping control laboratory not too far away from you all. So how does Anti-Doping Norway collaborate or maybe interact with this WADA-accredited lab and other stakeholders to even further enhance anti-doping efforts?
Well, in fact, they're just a couple of minutes drive from our office at Ullevål Stadium here in Oslo. So we've had a long and good collaboration with them for a long time, of course. And the testing department in particular, they meet with the laboratory on a regular basis, mostly to discuss practical matters related to testing and analysis, but also the Nordic Athlete Passport Management Unit is located at the lab. And we have frequently interactions and follow-up meetings with them regarding all the biological passports of the Norwegian athletes. So it's been very useful. And we have also had some collaboration on development of analytical methods over the years. And more recently, we have, together with Anti-Doping Denmark, collaborated to set up DBS analysis in Oslo. And I think actually the Oslo lab is the only WADA accredited lab that have positive DBS samples so far. I think there's been 1 or 2 DBS cases, and they are both in Oslo. So it shows that collaboration with the lab is also very important, of course.
Absolutely. And I know there are many unanswered questions in anti-doping, as we alluded to, but you and the team there at Anti-Doping Norway and your collaborators and colleagues around the world are doing amazing work to address some of these. But oftentimes funding, staff, resources, time, all of these things kind of hinder the work that you would like to get done. So Fredrik, if we gave you all of the resources you could dream of, is there one particular problem in anti-doping that you would want to solve most?
That's a very interesting, but also a very difficult question to answer. Mm-hmm. First of all, I think it would be important to try to even the playing field among the national anti-doping organizations, because today we have some well-funded NATOs, which are doing a great job on all aspects of anti-doping, while others are doing very little or a bare minimum. But then when you get the increased funding, it's equally important that the increased funding is used effectively. As you may know, and we discussed that in the paper, there have been some critical voices in the literature claiming that anti-doping has become an industry where the main goal is to employ more people and that it does not make any difference what these people are doing, which is an exaggerated statement maybe, but still food for thought, I think. And it's our job to prove that that is not correct. We must focus on improving quality and effectiveness in what we're doing every day. And lastly, I believe that there are a lot to be done when it comes to research on the NATO side. A lot of excellent research are done by the labs, but not so much by the NATOs. But we should, to an even larger degree, share failures, experiences, good practice with each other, and maybe through research papers so they can be accessible to everyone, so that we can learn from each other and avoid doing the same mistakes or reinventing the wheel. I think there's been some examples of that in anti-doping. So we should use the resources we got more effectively. That will benefit the whole community, I think.
Absolutely. And I think to ensure that everything is operating effectively and the most efficiently, you need this research to kind of figure out what works best. So what has really enabled Anti-Doping Norway to be successful in establishing this anti-doping research portion of the NATO?
I think we are a well-funded NATO. We collect a lot of samples. We conduct a lot of lectures, prevention, education work. So for us, the next stage was to start looking at what we're doing and maybe try to do things with an even higher quality and more effectively. We have been involved in research for many years, but now in the last 2-3 years, we have increased that focus to a large degree. And now we're seeing the results of that, with some papers on our work that can help us for sure, but maybe it can inspire and also be of help to other NATOs and other ADOs working in the field.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is fantastic. Are there any other unique features or particular strengths of Anti-Doping Norway that you want to make sure the listeners are aware of?
I think the fact that we have such a broad basis when it comes to activities has been very useful for us to be active in all levels of sport, in all the 55 sport federations in Norway, but also outside organized sports, in fitness centers and in collaboration with police and customs and armed forces and others. It gives you experience and you learn stuff that you can bring into the organization and use in other areas. So that's been, at least from my side, it's been very useful. And also the fact that we want to collaborate with other organizations, whether it is the university sector or other organizations working in the same field as ourselves, that we can share experiences and learn from each other. That has been very important for the development and strengthening of Anti-Doping Norway over the years.
Wonderful. Well, Fredrik, I have enjoyed learning more about you and your work and Anti-Doping Norway during our conversation. If our listeners want to learn even more, what is the best way for them to do so?
Well, you can go to our website, antidopinginoneword.no, but then you have to speak Norwegian. So it's maybe not that useful for most listeners. You can follow me on my LinkedIn page and also read most of the research on ResearchGate. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me also on my email. Maybe you can provide that in the text describing the podcast.
Fantastic. Well, Fredrik, we appreciate you sharing those resources and opportunities to connect. Listeners, definitely get in touch with Fredrik if you have questions or you want to learn more about the wonderful work they are doing there at Anti-Doping Norway. And Fredrik, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
And listeners, great to have you here with us as well. If you haven't already, it would mean a lot to us at the PCC if you could rate our podcast and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.